This episode of the Vincast, Australia's premier wine podcast, is brought to you in part by differentdrop.com, at the cutting edge of sourcing Australia's most innovative, sustainable and exciting wines. They are sourcing some really fantastic producers, usually made in very small volumes, and really they're so ahead of the game that they've been on the bandwagon for some producers who are only now starting to get the recognition they so truly deserve. If you go to differentdrop.com, you'll find a huge selection of wines made by producers around the country. A lot of the time, they might be previous guests of this podcast, or maybe they'll be future guests of this podcast. And you can put together your own little pack, or you can choose one of the packs that the guys have put together so lovingly, and they'll ship it out to you anywhere in Australia. And it only takes maybe 2 to 3 days. If you spend over $150, they will charge no freight. So all you need to do is seek out some wines on the website, put in the special code VINCAST at purchase, and for your first order over $100, you'll get $25 off. What a fantastic deal. So thank you, Different Drop, for your support of this podcast and all those great Australian wines. On episode 62 of the Vincast, I talk with Julian Castagna, the original biodynamic vintner based in Beechworth, who shares his stories about discovering wine whilst working as a director in the UK, and then how he came to establish one of the great vineyards in Victoria. Hello there, Vincasters, and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Garesbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and as always, it's great to have you on board. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode of the podcast with Neil Prentice, Titan of Australian wine, and particularly Melbourne hospitality. It was a great chat. I enjoyed it, and I hope you did. If you did, please let Neil and myself know. You can do it on social media, or even better, if you go to the iTunes page for the Vincast, leave us a rating and review, name check Neil, send us some feedback. I love hearing from people. It's great when people hit me up on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, sharing what they've enjoyed about the podcast. But it's also good to hear, if you've got people you'd like to hear from, particularly if you think there's someone involved with wine that would be able to share a fantastic story. I'd love to hear from you. So please, guys, I'd love hearing from you. Before I start this week's episode with another icon of Australian wine, I just wanted to share with you on YouTube. I'm not sure if you've seen some of the Let's Taste videos I've been posting, including the recent Let's Taste Live, where we tasted some Australian Grenache. My friend James Dawson, who is a sommelier, and I, which was fantastic. It was great to have people on the live stream. Next week, on Wednesday, the 12th of August at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, I'm going to have my first winemaking guest joining me live, showing me some new releases. It'll be former podcast guest Brendan Carter from Unicozello, fabulous wine producer, very small wine producer based in the Adelaide Hills, very dynamic, sourcing fruit from a couple of different South Australian regions. He's going to be showing me 4 of his new Fiano wines, as well as a couple of other ones, which I'm really excited about. So please, if you are interested in joining us on the stream, you go to YouTube, go to the Intrepid Wino channel, and you'll see that the live stream of Let's Taste Live Unicozello, and you can jump on the stream at 6 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time on the 12th of August, and you can share your comments and ask questions of Brendan, and I'll be happy to ask them on the podcast. And you'll be able to buy the wines as well at differentdrop.com. The following week, on the 17th of August, Monday evening, same time, I'll be joined by Gary Mills from Jamshed Wines, also former guest of the podcast. So for this week, I have a real icon of Australian wine, Julian Castagna, who is pretty much the original biodynamic vintner here in Australia. He had a very interesting career, particularly in terms of film. He worked as a filmmaker and worked in UK and USA as well. And he started a vineyard in Beechworth, and found that he responded to some beautiful biodynamic wines in Europe, and so decided that he wanted to make his wine the same way. So he joined me and shared his fascinating story. I hope you enjoy it. Please let me know at the end of the episode. I'll be able to share with you the social media channels to share with and also comment on and send us your feedback. But I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you on the other side. Julian, thank you so much for making some time to be here, to be on the Vincast. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I typically start every episode with my guest asking them what their initial interaction with wine was that sort of set them on the path of being involved with wine and devoting their love, of wine to life.
In London, I was living in London at a time when great wine was still affordable. And I was trying very hard to get a job in films and finding it more difficult than
what sort of job?
I was doing whatever I could.
Really?
Yeah.
Even like Doug's Body type stuff, just
involved
with anything you could?
I cleaned houses, I did all sorts of things.
But I mean, did you want to be an actor or a
No,
writer
I want to be.
director?
I had already been a film director. I'd worked here and I'd worked in Spain, but London at that time had a union policy, and you had to have a union ticket to apply for a job,
right?
And you couldn't apply for a job unless you had a union ticket.
What sort of films had you made?
Oh, I mean, lots of things. But I worked for the ABC here, and then somebody called Boris Dambus and I went to and worked in Sweden, which was a total disaster for Swedish television.
Right.
And then we went to Spain, and I got into advertising. And somebody offered me a job in London, which didn't eventuate. And so I was in London, pretty broke. And,
right.
And I met a guy, the husband of one of Carol Ann's friends, who was a wine broker.
Okay.
And
so it was just like socially
it
with him. It wasn't going out.
I'd always drunk wine at home with my parents,
right?
And so it wasn't that I was unfamiliar with wine, but I was certainly unfamiliar with great wine.
Where did you originally grow up?
I came to Australia when I was about 2, so I grew up in Melbourne.
You were born in England?
I was born in Italy.
Italy? Oh,
yes.
Cool. Okay. Whereabouts?
In Trieste.
Lovely.
Carso. Yes, yeah. And so,
but you. Did they have the same kind of culture of drinking wine when they moved here, in terms of like having wine with food, that kind of thing?
My parents were very gentle folk, and so the wine that they drank out of a flagon, and
sure.
And at the beginning of the week, it tasted pretty good. At the end of the week, it tasted pretty horrible.
That's a very Istrian way of doing things.
It is. And then, but I met somebody in the first Oddbins. There was one Oddbin store in Monmouth Street in London.
Yeah.
A guy called Ken Norman. Mm-hmm. And I was broke. And he started teaching me about wine. He'd say, "Why don't you taste that?"
Were you working there, or just social?
No, just social. No,
okay.
Looking for wine.
Sure.
Sure. And
a cultural thing to do.
Yeah. And at one point, he said, "I need you to drink a bit wider than you're drinking." So I said, "But I'm broke." He said, "Well, tell me how much money you've got."
Right.
Per bottle, and I'll find you things to drink. And he did. I said I have 50 pence per bottle.
Far out.
And they were still affordable at that stage. And Oddbins at that time truly was Oddbins. What they bought was stuff that no one else wanted.
Yeah.
Oddbins here, it was amazing.
But was it a bit hit and miss as far as?
Oh yes, no,
Sure.
there was a lot of miss, but there was an amazing amount of hits. Amazing amount of hits. And
If you know what you're looking for, I guess.
yeah, well, and then he had a cellar full of wine in bond.
You're gonna have to explain that to me.
Okay, in England, you don't have to pay tax on it till you take it out of an area which has. You bring it out into the general public, so to speak.
Okay, so it's like an importer imports spirits into Australia and they leave it on the dock, but when it's sold, that's when you
when you pay.
So it's like deferring a tax.
That's right. But what you could do is you could go in and you were allowed to go in and taste the wine.
Ah.
So I'd bring a bit of ham and bread.
Yeah.
And we'd go in and taste the wine. And what we were doing was, and he had some amazing wines.
Right.
Truly amazing wines.
Mostly French?
Mostly French.
Sure.
A bit of Italian, a bit of Barolo, but mostly French.
Was there much good Italian wine back in those days?
Oh, yes. There were some fantastic Barolos around that no one knew for nothing.
Wow.
Pennies. I mean, I remember in that sort of area buying 68 Castagna for £5 a bottle.
Wow.
Okay.
Was that would have been one of the earliest vintages, surely?
Yeah, it was the first or second vintage.
There you go.
Yeah. So
amazing.
And they couldn't sell it. And so I bought 68, 70, 71, 72 for pennies. And anyway, so that's really I have and you get caught up in it, and I caught, and then.
But you got an appreciation for
fine
nuances
wine.
and
but also
regional...
I mean the other thing is I was working by this time. This is over a period of time. Mm-hmm. By this time I was working. I was in film as an assistant director. Mm-hmm. The guy I worked for loved wine but knew nothing about it. Mm. So I bought his wine. So I had a massive budget to play with. Whatever I wanted, and he would say, well, whatever you want. You buy it, and that's good. So I bought it, and so I was invited to all the major tastings. I was always invited to, and Ken Norman, who was the guy from Oddbins, there was a moment there when the 61 first growths were released, and they knew he was a broker, so the companies wouldn't sell them to him because they knew that he would resell them. Mm. But I was a buyer, and so they would sell them to me. So I would buy them for him, and he'd palm off some of them to me as payment.
Sure.
So that's how I started my cellar.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
What were the earliest impressions you have of wine? What's can you remember specifically what it was you connected with about wines that you particularly enjoyed back then?
I mean, it's the same thing that I enjoy now. I think wine is a food, and because I love food, that's part of the culture for me. It's a process. Drinking wine by itself is for me not an amazing happening. Whereas I think drinking wine that matches and makes food taste better, or eating food that makes wine taste better, is an amazing thing for me.
Were your parents into food? Like,
yeah.
Grow
my
up
mother,
kind of having love of cooking?
My mother was an amazing cook.
Mm-hmm.
She could turn grass into something that you want to eat
and
pay for.
Particularly, were both of your parents from that part of Italy?
Yeah. My mother told me after we started the vineyard that my grandfather grew wine for a living.
Oh, really?
And I didn't know that because I certainly knew he made wine, but I simply assumed when she said he made wine that he simply did things which is what most Italian people do. They make enough for themselves.
Sure.
But in fact, that's how they made their living.
Right. What was their business when they moved to Australia?
My father was a builder, a bricklayer to start off with,
Sure.
and then a builder.
Classic.
Yeah.
So you ate well when you were in England?
Well, not always. I mean, I was broke. I mean, in those early years, I was broke, and so I learned to cook as well again. And I'd write home to my mother and say, that dish that you used to do, how do I cook it? And we'd go to the market and at the end of the day and buy things that whatever was left.
Odd bins.
Yeah, and I learned to cook doing that.
So how did you eventually come back to Australia?
I came back I was asked to come back to do a film called Cyclone Tracy, which didn't eventuate, and eventually became a television series. I wanted our children to be educated in Australia, and I wanted them to be Australian rather than English. Sure. And they were starting to become very little Lord Fauntleroy English.
It's probably a reference. I'm not sure how many of my listeners would get that reference.
So that we came back and in the early 80s, and the film didn't happen, but I started a company that made advertising films.
Sure.
Did other things, but advertising things that made money, which was very successful.
Yep. Where were you based?
Based in Sydney.
Okay.
And then I was working in New York for a little while as well.
Sure.
So I've worked in London, New York, and Sydney really. A bit in Melbourne, but mostly those cities.
As far as access to wines, the kind of wines you were able to enjoy, Sydney, New York, were they? By the time I became a director, it was easy, and even when I was an assistant director and I was working with Cliff, the director I told you about was a guy called Cliff Owen, who's made a lot of quite famous movies, and I had this ability to buy whatever I chose. Sure.
So I'd go, I'd look on lists and I'd say, we'll try that, and that.
Yeah. And
so I had an amazing upbringing in terms of palate.
Did you ever have much opportunity to go and visit wine regions?
Oh no, all the time. Because what I would do is whenever we filmed near a wine region, they'd go back and I'd stay for a couple of days.
Yeah, cool.
And because I wasn't a threat, I was a film guy.
Yeah.
People were
it wasn't like you were stealing secrets or anything.
People were very generous.
Sure.
And so I often did vintage is not the correct word because I did very little, but I often was present watching during vintage very often during the time we lived in London.
Did you ever film anything?
No.
Filming
was for money.
Yeah, of course. And what sort of, did you kind of take notes or kind of connect with particular wines like biodynamic?
No. I mean, biodynamics came later. That was a different thing because it was sort of a process that happened to me for once. It was always in my head, but really I was when we started, we thought of being sustainable, whatever that means.
Sure.
It's about as nebulous as natural wine is in terms of what it means. And so for me, it was, I learned wine because I drank great wine.
Sure.
So I really, I had fantastic wines. I mean, really fantastic wines. I had wines back to the 1880s. We had, I mean, it was all available and affordable. And so, and when it wasn't affordable, I would buy it when we were filming.
Sure. When you eventually did sort of move back to Australia, what were your impressions of Australian wines back then?
I really didn't like it very much.
Was what in particular was?
Just because they were too big. They were all too big. It seemed to me that none of them really matched what I thought of as wine.
Could you sort of see why they did start to have a lot of success, particularly overseas?
I know why they had success because the French stuffed it up. I mean, what happened when Australian wine became well known in London? I can only talk about London.
Of course.
It changed from the power being with merchants, who were very powerful, to supermarkets being powerful. So the person who bought wine went from being the husband who had a relationship with a merchant to the wife who did the shopping.
So,
and
just the regular grocery shopping, and
it became bottled wine, and wine became interesting, and the French were making horrible, cheap wine at that stage, just horrible, and we were making this really tasty stuff, and it was a learning process. So they would take a bottle of Australian wine off the shelf
that said Shiraz or Chardonnay
or Chardonnay or whatever, and it really didn't matter what else was on the bottle, as long as it said Chardonnay, Shiraz or Cabernet.
That was the right price,
and it was the right price, and it said Australia.
Sure,
it always tasted okay.
Sure, and you had the fortune of drinking some great examples of European wines, and that's what you didn't find in Australian wines.
And that's what I didn't find. And I came back, and there were a bunch of us people most of us working in advertising, either film or advertising, and we had a group of people who bought and drank wine. We'd have a serious something at least once a month, and we were called the Full Moon Club, and because our first tasting was on a night of the full moon a long time ago.
What a coincidence!
And then it all sort of, they were all, they kept showing me some huge wines, and I'd say, I really like a glass, but I don't want to drink any more than a glass.
Yeah, of course. And
I stumbled a time on a bottle of Gioconda Cabernet, and I suddenly thought, now we're back. Now we're talking again. And I rang Rick and said, I really like your wine. And he said, well, come visit me. He said, make sure you bring some bottles. I had a cellar full of amazing stuff, and he had very little at that stage.
Right.
And I got to know him. And then I realised that there were wines of that quality available in Australia, that the people that I had associated with took me down the big path.
It is interesting the way that can happen. Like, you connect with one producer, and this producer might say, oh, well, actually, you should try the wines from this person in this region, and that kind of, it's like dominoes, I guess, a little bit.
And so I slowly found all the stuff that is lovely, and there is much that is lovely.
And at what point did you start to think about, establishing something for yourself? The idea about making your own wine.
It was never an intention. It really wasn't an intention. I got to a point in the middle, I guess in the middle of 1990, 95, 96, and I was not enjoying it anymore.
The advertising.
I was being paid a huge amount of money, and no one was listening. And I thought, this is not for me.
Sure.
This is not where I want to be in my life. And so I thought, so what do I do? And I thought, well, I only know two things. I know film and I know wine. And wine really isn't brain surgery. And so I thought, if Italian and French peasants can make it, I can make it.
So you thought, I'd like to make it. Did you ever consider sort of importing it or that sort of thing?
Never, no. It would. I mean, I'm a producer.
Sure.
One way or another, what I am is a producer.
Of course, in terms of making film, making wine.
Yeah. So for me,
you're an auteur.
Yeah. It never. I'm very happy to drink other people's great wines, but I don't want to sell it to anyone.
Sure. Then you feel more fulfilled, saying I've made this.
Yeah, I mean, I think in 15 years we've done okay. I think we make one of Australia's great Shirazes. and I think we make us one of Australia's great Sangioveses. I think that's pretty good for a tiny producer like me in 15 years.
So when you got the idea to make wine, you wanted to be from start to finish. You wanted to be a vigneron, as they would say, in terms of growing the grapes from your vines and make the wine yourself. That was like what?
Well, there was never any other way. It didn't occur to me that I could do anything else.
Sure.
You know, I mean, if you want to make film, you have to choose the actor.
Sure.
If you want to make wine, you have to choose the grape.
Sure.
And that means growing it.
Apologies for interrupting this fascinating wine chat, but I just wanted to briefly acknowledge another supporter of the podcast, Plum Glassware, an Australian-owned and Australian-designed glassware brand that is made from high-quality crystal in Europe. Research was conducted by the guys at Plum to determine that realistically you only need 2 shapes for red and 2 shapes for white. Now, unlike other glassware brands who might have a different glass shape for every variety and every style of wine you could possibly imagine, they have simplified things for the consumer, and they have a red A and red B, and a white A and a white B, and that really covers you for the main styles of wine that you could find. They also have a flute for sparkling wines and champagnes. They have different product ranges. They have an outdoor range as well, but they also produce some really beautiful decanters, and hopefully I'll be able to get a decanter on my YouTube channel, Intrepid Wino, and I'll do a little video about the importance of decanting wine. But if you want to learn more about Plum, simply go to plum.com and you'll be able to find out all the information. So thank you very much, Plum, for your support of this podcast.
And when you started to think about places that you might like to make, you know, it was always going to be in Australia?
Yes, I didn't really want to go back to Europe.
Right.
We looked at a time about me making wine in France, and that was a possibility for a while. But you know, I really had no training. My training came from my palate, and so really it wasn't something that would have been viable.
Right.
So, and I had to prove that what I had in my head would work.
Right. So when you thought about where you'd like to do it in Australia, did it take you long to consider
Yeah, I did,
Beechworth?
because I really didn't want to go back to Victoria. I ran away from Melbourne when Melbourne wasn't a nice place to live in. You know, Melbourne has become Australia's premier city, in my opinion. Victoria was somewhere I didn't want to come back to. But I kept looking, and I kept coming back. I kept looking at other people's work and tasting other people's fruit. And I kept coming back to Beechworth. I kept coming back, and I realised pretty soon that Beechworth is potentially one of the great terroirs of Australia, and it will be recognised as such in time.
And I'm sure that you know, with your affinity with these great wines from Europe, you know, coming from predominantly cooler climates, I'm sure that sort of definitely played into it.
Yeah.
So, what were your first steps to establish your own site in Beechworth?
So, well, it was again finding a piece of land that worked. Traditionally, the land in Beechworth is very skinny.
When you say skinny,
meaning there isn't richness in the soil. Good enough for 1 sheep per hectare. But I looked at the 2 producers that I liked there, and they were doing really interesting things, and they were on different bits of dirt. There was
I guess Gioconda and Sorenberg.
Absolutely. And I thought, yeah, okay. So I really looked for land that was similar to Gioconda.
Sure.
And we found a bit. And in the first year, and then we planted, and then I knew that I wanted to make wine different from the traditional way that was being made in Australia, where things were acidified and it was all manipulation.
The rose were the Charles Sturt.
Yeah.
Wine by numbers.
Yeah.
Brian Rankin.
So
Bryce Rankin, sorry.
So I didn't want to do that, and so we bought some fruit, and it was an interesting experiment because both Rick and I bought 2 side-by-side rows from a vineyard in the Alpine Valleys, and we both made wine. And that year I made wine at Gioconda because I didn't have a winery as yet, and the wines were quite different, and that was simply because of my attitude and his attitude, which was, and I found that extremely interesting. And then the next year we had planted 2 years earlier, and so in the 99 vintage I dropped everything other than 1 bunch of it off every vine.
That's low yield.
And we made some wine, and a friend took a bottle and entered it into the Adelaide Top 100, 2,500 wines, and I won. And I entered it the following year, and I won again. And I entered it the following year, and our rosé won it the following year. And I thought, no, that's now that's enough. I don't want to keep doing this. And then the vineyard started speaking. And when we started, our intention was to be sustainable. So we weren't going to use nasties, but we were going to use whatever was required. And in that very first year, we were hit by something called the African black beetle. And what the African black beetle is a naturally occurring bug which eats roots of grass. Generally, I cleaned the grass up, and so it ate the vines. And so I got experts in, and they said use a product which I won't mention, but it was a horribly dreadful product. And we went and bought it because I wasn't going to lose what I'd done. I'd invested almost everything they'd left by that stage. And on the can was a big head and crossbones saying, if you get it on your hands, get off your tractor. Make sure you wear breathing apparatus, wear full body cover. If you get it on your body, get off the tractor and go and have a shower. And shower for at least 10 minutes. And I thought, wow.
And if it's saying that, then what's it actually doing to the vines and to the
and I thought,
fruit?
Here I'm trying to make one of the great wines of the world, and I'm about to put this rubbish onto the soil. And I said, no, it can't be. And so I started making phone calls and got on an airplane and wandered around the world, talked to anyone who would talk to me about. And because it seemed to, I remembered at that stage that I really liked what I tasted from biodynamic wines, a few producers that I tasted biodynamically. So I just went around the world talking to everybody who would talk to me. And I came across James Milton in New Zealand, who was an amazing help. Other people as well, but James really. And the Biodynamic Association here in Australia. And then I started reading, and I got involved, and that's how we became what we are.
How big was biodynamic agriculture in Australia at that point?
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't.
There wasn't anyone doing it seriously. There were lots of people trying to change the earth,
right?
But no one doing it because it made it taste better.
Right. So not even food, nothing.
Nothing. And it was really something that I did. I then got voted. I became the chairman of Biodynamic Agriculture Australia. We had some money for education, and I said we should do a conference and bring great wine makers from around the world, and they should talk to us about biodynamics and why they are biodynamic, and then I'll show them with wine why it's special. So in November 2004 we did that, and from that group, really almost everybody who's biodynamic today in Australia came out of that conference. It's about 160 people came.
What were the decisions about what varieties to plant on your vineyard? Was it you just sort of chose the kind of wines you liked and said, what are they made from?
Yes, sort of.
So I know that like someone like...
I mean, look, the Shiraz, I knew that there was great Shiraz being made on granite.
Okay. In the northern Rhone.
And I knew there was good Sangiovese being made on granite. And when I walked on the Lang, it seemed to me that it to have many similarities to Tuscany, which is why we put Sangiovese in.
Sure.
We planted Viogna. I planted because I wanted the essence of what Viogna does to Shiraz, and so I didn't even consider whether it was good for the land, whether it was right. We planted Shiraz. I needed some Viogna, so we planted some of that. And the Sangiovese was simply something that seemed to me might work, and it has.
I would have to agree with that. And as far as the way that you were making the wines, as far as whether you would blend stuff or whether you would do it on its own, was that just all kind of experimenting, or you talked with people? Worked out what?
Just tasting. Okay. Yeah, clearly I talk with people.
Sure.
But in essence, it was just tasting. For example, when we made the Alhambra bread, we started off making it with Shiraz and Merlot, and I didn't like that. Okay, then I made it with Shiraz and Pinot, and I liked that. Then the following year, I couldn't get the sort of Pinot I wanted, and we were growing Nebbiolo that I was basically throwing away because I didn't think it was ready yet. And I thought, well, why don't we try some of that Nebbiolo?
Now, you mentioned Adam's Rib. Adam is also the name of your son.
Yes.
And he's, of course, involved with the business now. At what point did he sort of start to get interested in joining you in the vineyards and the cellar? Okay,
well, he was working in bars and clubs in Sydney.
Okay.
And I suspect, although he's never said it, that he had an emotional upheaval in terms of women. And I was building our winery.
Sure.
And I said, "Do you want to come and help?" He said, "Yeah, why not?" So he said, "I'll come for 6 months."
And how long has it been now?
I don't know. He came in '80, so 15 years almost. In 2000. So
sure. And he kind of embraced the sustainability and the way of making the wines pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Did you ever kind of butt heads on anything?
No. I mean, the only complication he started doing the Wagga course, which I encouraged because I wanted him to do that. But it was a complication because he'd come back and he'd say, "Well, we should do that," and I'd go, "No. We're not going to do that." and then he'd say, "Well, they said we should do that," and I said, "Yeah, that's one way of doing it, but I don't want to do it that way."
Sure.
And so this went on for a while, and in the end, he said to me, "Why am I going there, Dad?" And I said, "So you can learn the science." He said, "No, you've taught me the science. Why am I going there?" He said, "I go. They tell me what's right, and you come back and say they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
I said, I don't quite say that. I don't say that they don't know what they're talking about. I'm just saying that's not how we want to do it.
Yeah, you know what's right for you, but it might not be right for someone else. But,
correct. And he said, well, if you don't mind, I'm going to stop. So he did, and so he stopped.
Sure.
So I guess he's learned from me in the same way as I learned from the people around me in bottles of wine. Mm-hmm. And he seems to be enjoying it. But he met a girl, and it's always that.
Helps.
It's always that.
And like there is sort of this lovely community now, I guess, as far as vignerons who are working in that sustainable, particularly biodynamics. And of course, you were heavily involved with Return to Terroir, or Renaissance des Appellations. And just this year, I think it was the second time the whole group had the opportunity to come out to Australia. And how have you found the consumers, the trade and the consumers have approached these wines made in a different style?
If what they tell me is truthful, and I have no reason to doubt that it should be otherwise, they're saying that they are amongst the best tastings they go to in any 1 year. Mm-hmm. In many ways, the first tasting at Zinc had more excitement because it had never been done before, and so that is always nice. But it was what we did here at the town hall in Melbourne in March this year was very well attended. Lots of people saying good things about it.
I guess in the same way that, the first year you enter the Adelaide Top 100, it's like, okay, that's great, we won it. Let's put it in next year. Oh, we won it again. Lovely. That's it's a nice consistency. So it's probably good for people to come back or to have at least heard about it the first time and to come and go, okay, cool, yeah, this is exactly, people have been talking this up. They've been really excited about biodynamics and the way people are expressing the wines and expressing the terroir. I like what I'm seeing here.
That wine is a product of nature, and nature changes, and biodynamics is a way of explaining that. And which is why I find what's become known as a natural wine movement a bit confusing sometimes, because I know that there are people who are selling wines without sulfur and calling it natural that have come from a vineyard that is both fertilized with salt-based fertilizers and has Roundup used on the soil. So there's a lot of that out there, and I think it's a great shame, because I think it's a bad thing.
Well, and if Julian, if you're confused, imagine how the consumer must feel.
It's a terrible thing. 4 years ago, I took Adam and Alexei, my other son, to Italy to stand in what was my grandfather's vineyard. And while we were there, we tasted a lot of amazing wines that were made on skins. And I really had no knowledge of those wines. For me, it was a really new experience. And I ran into the wines of an Italian producer called Dario Pritic, which I like very much. And we came back and we started mucking around with skin contact. At first, only 4 and 5 and 6 days, little bits. And those wines have turned out, although they were not understood at that time, have actually turned out to be amazing wines. Really, really, really interesting. But in the 2013 vintage, we did a full 30 days skin contact. And it's just been one of the English newspapers, The Independent, did a top 13 in the world, and we're in the top 3 with that one wine. And what's interesting about that is that the wine is clean. It has all the
clear.
Yes, I mean slightly filtered, not very highly filtered, but slightly filtered. But it's clean. There's no VA. There's no bad oxidization.
Mm-mm.
None of that horrible aldehyde stuff that's so much out there that I don't like. So, and I think people are confused by that.
Yes. And I mean, and like that's why I don't like the term orange wine myself, because orange refers to a color, and people are considering orange wine as wine made from white grapes on skins. Yet you can have some really beautiful, bright yellowy golden wines with quite extended skin contact.
Yeah.
Doesn't resemble orange. Doesn't have that thick
no,
kind
because
of colour.
the colour comes to how hot you allow the fermentation.
Exactly.
I mean, it's really a very simple thing. If you ferment it hot, you'll get some of that extracted, and it'll become quite dark. But I mean, the one we have, the Harlequin we have, is considered an orange wine because that was its moniker in terms of what the world thinks.
Yes.
But it actually isn't very orange at all.
Mm-mm. Well, that's exciting. I'm not sure if I actually tried the Harlequin. I'll have to
It's really good.
sort of seek out a bottle of that, but I'm very interested. But thank you very much, Julian. I really do appreciate you making the time and being down here in Melbourne and being on the podcast. As far as people following Castagna or yourself do you do much with social media yourself?
I don't do as much as I should, and I get Adam criticizes, but he does enough for both of us.
But if people wanted to follow you on Twitter or
I mean, Twitter is I think Twitter is Castagna Wine. I think Facebook is
I think it's just Castagna.
Is it?
I think so.
Okay, well you know better than me. There you go. There you go.
Castagna Vineyard.
Yeah.
But the website where people can find more information and where they might be able to buy some of your wine?
www.castagna.com.au.
Pretty easy to remember.
It is.
And have you got any launches?
In fact, we have. We do a pre-release each year, and that actually finished, and which we give a really, because my mailing list is so important to me. People who buy off us have the opportunity to buy the wines at really a fantastic price, so the wines are released now, but they don't get them till November.
Right.
So
hence a pre-release.
Yeah. So it's a true pre-release. In this case, all the wines except the rosé are already in glass. The rosé isn't yet because we were a bit late in bottling, and then it got too cold, and I was worried about reduction. So we're probably going to wait till September before that's bottled.
But there will be wines released in November.
There will.
Exciting news. But thank you again, and I look forward to trying some wines very soon.
Okay.
Thank you guys, as always, for listening to another episode of the Vincast. I have been James Scaresbrook, otherwise known as the Intrepid Wino, and of course, you can follow me on social media on Twitter and Instagram. I am at Intrepid Wino, and the podcast can be found on Twitter at the Vincast. If you go to facebook.com/Intrepid Wino, you'll find my Facebook page. And if you go to Intrepid Wino channel on YouTube, you'll find some of the videos I've posted, including the Let's Taste and the upcoming Let's Taste Live with Brendan Carter and Gary Mills. You can find the podcast on iTunes, the podcasting app, of course, Stitcher, Player FM, and you can subscribe there, and that way you'll get the newest episode as soon as it goes live. And if you do that, please do leave a rating and a review, because it really does help me spread the story of the podcast. Of course, you can find all the information at www.intrepidwino.com, including every episode of the podcast and lots of different writings and videos that are going up all the time. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you to Julian for joining me. Looking forward to next week's episode with Jenny Port. But until next time, bye.